But I went back to see one of these men, Tom Phillips, who was the president of the largest corporation in New England. I'd been his general counsel. I walked in his office one day and still feeling kind of empty. And I looked at him and he was a completely different guy. He was a guy like myself who'd worked his way up the hard way, self-made man, became head CEO of this corporation when he was barely 40 years old. Dynamic guy. And he was at peace, and he started asking me about my family. And finally I said to him, "Tom, you've changed since I saw you 4 years ago." He said, "Yes, I have, Chuck." And then he looked up at the clock, and he didn't look me straight in the eye, but he said, "I have accepted Jesus Christ and committed my life to him." Now, I got to tell you, good people, I took a firm grip on the bottom of my chair. I'd never heard anyone talk like that. I grew up in that vast Unitarian wasteland of New England. I never heard the gospel. I never heard anybody talk about Christ as a person. I'd gone to Sunday school and learned all the lessons you learn in Sunday school, but it didn't mean anything to me. He looked away, as I later found out, because he'd never done this with anyone before. Kind of interesting. I thought about that for the next 3 months, and I couldn't get it out of my mind. And so I went back to him one evening in August of 1973, and I said, "Tom, you got to explain this to me." And he said, "Before I do, I want to read you a chapter from a book, a chapter I'd recommend for all of you, particularly because you're type A, high achievers. You wouldn't be at Columbia or otherwise." And he read to me the chapter from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity entitled "The Great Vice, the Great Sin, Pride." Proud man is always looking through life, looking down on other people and things, and therefore can't see something above himself, immeasurably superior God. I listened to this chapter, and C.S. Lewis, if you know him, the Oxford dean, who was a great Christian apologist, as well as a great professor of medieval literature, I listened to that and I realized he's writing about me. I thought I'd done all these good things because I wanted to serve my country and I wanted to be a success at my profession, and it was really all about me. And I sat there that night in pain listening to that chapter read. And then Tom told me how he'd gone forward at a crusade here in New York with Billy Graham preaching and given his life to Christ. And I was really moved. He wanted to pray with me, and I said, no, I'd never prayed except in a church, so he prayed. I left his home that night, and here I was, a former Marine captain, and yeah, I was known as the White House hatchet man, the tough guy. That wasn't very good when my book came out in Germany, and they translated hatchet man, and I noticed after they translated my book, Chuck Colson, the White House hatchet man, that they'd translated it in German, Chuck Colson, the White House executioner. That, I didn't win many audiences when I went to Germany with my book when it was translated there. But that night he told me of his own experience when he gave his life to Christ. And here I was, the tough guy, and I don't think I'd ever cried or I'd let anyone know if I did. I left his home that night. I looked back and I got into the automobile and I tried to drive away, but I could not because the tough guy was crying too hard. I couldn't see the road in front of me. I pulled over and sat there. I have no idea for how long, at least an hour, maybe longer, thinking about my life, thinking about could there be a God, and if there were, could I know him? And I just called out to him. I didn't know any of the words. I'd never seen any brochures about evangelicalism. I never knew there was such a thing. I knew nothing about organized Christianity, except I'd once in a while been dragged to church as a kid. But that night, for the first time in my life, I was sure there was a God. And I was sure he was hearing me. I woke up the next morning figuring I was going to be embarrassed, and instead I couldn't wait to get my hands on Mere Christianity and read it from cover to cover. And I got out a yellow pad because I'm a lawyer, and I would have 2 columns. There is a God, there isn't a God. Jesus Christ is God, he isn't God. I went down that, and I went through the whole rational process, and I thought to myself, wow, I've never gone into a courtroom and argued against a mind like this. And so in the quiet of being off on the Maine coast, away from Watergate, before I was considered a target of the investigation, I simply quietly surrendered my life to Christ and asked him to come into my life. I will tell you, that's 35 years ago this past summer. Nothing about my life has been the same since. Nothing about my life can be the same again. It wasn't an emotional experience. It wasn't a one-time thing. I've been studying as deeply as I know how to study, as fervently as I know how to study. I am convinced Christ is who he says. I'm more convinced, as Malcolm Muggeridge once said, of the reality of Jesus Christ than I am of my own reality. Amazing.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now
Men, I came to know them as brothers, men that before in my life I'd have gone to any lengths to avoid meeting or being with. But above all, I saw the miracle of how God works in the life of man.
The first time I met Chuck Colson, I was in state-issued clothes in prison. And he shook my hand and told me that there's a different way to live, that there's a path that I must take.
My chains are gone, I've